Jim Kearney met Jim Coon it was at a death penalty abolition rally that we were at, and I think the book fair was going on at the same time. So that's where we met. We started the conversation. Actually, Jim started the conversation. And the more we talked, it sure made sense to have him come in and present some information about his time during the Vietnam War as a conscientious objector. And you can introduce the gentleman with you.
Yeah, okay. My name is James Kearney. I go by Jim. I was a student at the University of Texas back in the 60s, in the heady days of the 60s. I did my undergraduate work there. But I should also mention that I invited Alan Pogue to come to the meeting. He's been here before, is familiar with your procedures. I'm not quite so familiar. Alan and I both were combat medics in Vietnam. We both served as combat medics. The difference is that I was also a conscientious objector, and Alan was not, although we share similar beliefs. And so my story is not only about myself, but about this unique classification that existed. It began with the 1940 Selective Service Act, which continued in force through the Vietnam War. It was a unique classification that allowed people who were willing to serve in the Army and put on a uniform to serve without weapons training and with the legal right to refuse the use of weapons. We constituted about 10% of all conscientious objectors. Most conscientious objectors refused to put on a uniform and did alternative service. They were called 1Os. That was the classification, but there was this 1AO classification for those of us who were actually willing to put on a uniform. We think this classification was designed originally for Seventh-day Adventists. And the majority of 1AOs always were Seventh-day Adventists. And this is because they had a very unique belief system that mandated both service and pacifism. So they wanted their members to serve, but they were pacifists. So the Army saw no problem with this, and so set up this classification. And it worked to perfection during World War II. The poster child for 1AOs would be Desmond Doss. You might have seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge. He was one of the most decorated soldiers in the Pacific Theater in World War II, and he was a Seventh-day Adventist 1AO conscientious objector. But something unusual happened during Vietnam. A certain percentage of 1AOs came in were also not just religious, but also political or personal in their ethical journey. They might have been religious, but their ethical journey was more personal. It was not so much related to a historic pacifist church. And this is what separated Vietnam 1AOs from all other wars. When I graduated in 1969 at the University of Texas, I lost my student deferment, as all students did at that time. 2S was a student deferment. You received a deferment as long as you were an undergraduate, making satisfactory progress toward your degree. But once you graduated, you were reclassified 1A, eligible for the draft. I came from a very conservative rural background. In Colorado County. I still live on the ranch I grew up on, and which this year we celebrated our 190th year of continuous ownership. It goes all the way back to the colonial period. But nonetheless, during my stay at the University of Texas, I became radicalized by stages, you should say. I became very much opposed to the Vietnam War, not only on historic reasons, but for ethical reasons. And when I was faced with the draft, it was a dilemma. And I felt the need to serve on the one hand, and yet I also felt a duty to my conscience on the other. And that became the title of my book, which Duty to Serve, Duty to Conscience, the story of two conscientious objector combat medics in Vietnam. So how to resolve this dilemma? I didn't want to avoid the draft, unlike some esteemed political leaders today who shall remain unnamed. But I also didn't want to kill and contribute as a soldier in this war. So this particular classification was my solution to the dilemma. I applied for it, and you had to apply for your local draft boards, and I was quite surprised when I was accepted. To my knowledge, I'm the only conscientious objector to ever be granted that status in Colorado County, where I came from. But the draft board knew I wasn't trying to get out of anything, because all 99% 1AOs were trained at Fort Sam Houston in a special unit called Echo 4, and became combat medics. So we lived a paradox. We were non-combat combat medics. And that's what is unique about our story. And of all the books that have been written about Vietnam, very few have been written. In fact, this is the first book about 1AOs who were perhaps more political than religious. And even there are a couple of books by those who were religious in there, but really only one legitimate book. So there's been very little written about this. Altogether, there were about 10,000 of us in Vietnam. Nearly all of us went to Vietnam, and a large percentage of us were assigned to frontline units. That is, we were embedded in combat units. So that was my case. If you talk to people about Vietnam, first, those of us who were there, we say, were you outside the wire or inside the wire? In other words, were you out in the field with the units doing the fighting, which was only about 20% of those who went to Vietnam, or were you in some big, huge base camp somewhere? So my tour of duty, I was outside the wire. I was assigned to an artillery unit, and then to an infantry unit in the Cambodian invasion. And finally, I was reassigned to the 1st Air Cav, and I volunteered to be a medevac medic. And our motto was "so that others may live." And that was a mantra, or whatever you want to call it, that was completely consistent with my beliefs. And in that capacity, I was seriously wounded, and on an all-volunteer mission that was very dangerous, a mission for which all of us received the Distinguished Flying Cross from the Commanding General of the 1st Air Cav. And after 4 or 5 months in various hospitals, I was discharged from the Army, and that was it. I'd done my deal. And so my story is my friend and I, whom I went through basic training with, and who ended up in the same outfit in Vietnam by the luck of the draw, and who actually was on duty at the aid station when I was wounded and gave me first aid. After the war, we decided to put the war behind us and go on about our lives. I eventually got my doctorate at the University of Texas, and I have been teaching there for the last 11 years. I'm in the Department of Germanic Studies at the University of Texas. And my specialty is Texas German history and literature. I've written 8 books, and most of which are about that. But at a certain point, and this is true, I think, of all veterans, whether they're conscientious objectors or regular soldiers, you feel a need to come to terms with the experience of war, those of us who really experienced the horrors of war. And my co-author Bill Komuro and I both felt this need as we approached the 50th anniversary of our service in Vietnam. Bill, who is a retired professor emeritus from the University of Emporia, Emporia State in Kansas, a distinguished Hispanic scholar. He's also a poet, and he had written a series of poems when he was in Vietnam, and he had these published as Vietnam typescript. For my part, I had made tape recordings of helicopter missions, including the mission where I was wounded. And in conjunction with the Bob Bullock Museum, we produced a podcast based on my tapes. And that was sort of my coming to terms in a way. That podcast, by the way, won a National Gold Medal for the best podcast produced by a museum in the United States for 2019. But then we also were actually approached by a publisher who said we should write our story. So jointly, Bill and I, since our experience was so connected, decided to write the book, Duty to Serve, Duty to Conscience. And it came out last year. It's our attempt to, to deal with this very intense experience. But it is not just about us. As we got into the book, it is about this unique classification, 1AO, and those of us who served as both combat medics and non-combatants. That's my story. Would we take questions, or how do we?
Yeah, any which way. I do have a question.
Yeah, sure, I'd be glad to.
So you graduated in 1969?
My undergraduate.
Undergraduate.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So what was and we were well into Vietnam at that point.
Absolutely.
What was it like on UT?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting what's happening today, because it's like these demonstrations you saw on the UT campus about the Gaza conflict times 10. I mean, it was constant, and it went on and on. The demonstrations were much more massive, but the reactions of the authorities were the same: paranoia, complete disregard for the First Amendment. The First Amendment is supposed to be impartial. There's not supposed to be discrimination based on what you're demonstrating against, But this is obviously the case. I mean, it's an absolute travesty what happened at the University of Texas over the past weekend. I mean, I don't get me started. But there were massive demonstrations, and it was a wonderful time because it wasn't just about Vietnam. It was the whole cultural effervescence of that period. That's when Austin became weird. That was the music scene, the art scene, Improbable Rise of Redneck Rock, Gentle Thursday. The Rag was became Thorn Dreyer, Alice Embry, became the voice of all that. And the Rag became one of the most important underground newspapers in the United States, and the campus at the University of Texas became ground zero for anti-war opposition in the state of Texas. That was ground zero. And so it was a heady time to come alive, to be a student. And although I never joined any of the organizations like the SDS, which was very active, it was actually founded by Thorn Dreyer and Alice Embry, who also founded the Rag. Although I never joined any of these, I was very much affected by it. And, who was it? Said that if somebody just read a book about Vietnam, read the history, Well, I did, I read Bryce Shower's book and I read J. Williams Fulbright's book, The Arrogance of Power. And these things helped shape my opinion about the war. And I just felt that I could not pick up arms with this war. So that was my dilemma. Yeah, it's a great time. Yeah.
I was in a long time ago before women were in combat areas. And I was wondering if nowadays women are going under those
Those rules and
Yeah.
well, the draft was abolished in 1973. And I might want to say something about that later, but right now, to answer your question, certainly at the time of Vietnam, women were not, there were lots of women in Vietnam, but they were, for the most part, nurses in the rear area hospitals, evacuation hospitals, like the 24th Evac in Saigon. There was another evacuation hospital in Cu Chi and these large base camps. They were never out in the field. They were volunteers, whom we somewhat pejoratively called donut dollars. And they were just, that was something that went back to World War II. These started to raise morale. They would come out and pass out donuts in the field occasionally, but never in a real combat situation. So now that,
Well, what I'm
that is,
thinking is, are women these days, because they're sent to combat, are they signing up for these conscientious objector status?
no, it doesn't. The 1AO, when the draft was abolished, these classifications were also abolished.
Oh, they were abolished.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You see, and in favor of an all-volunteer army, and so presumably you wouldn't volunteer for the army if you're a conscientious objector. However, there are provisions now. If you have a change of mind once you're in the army, you can apply for conscientious objector status. It's very rare. It happens occasionally. And if it's granted, you're dismissed from the army. You're not assigned a non-combatant role or something like that. You're simply dismissed from the army or the Air Force or whatever it might be.
I think Quaker House in Fayetteville, near what was Fort Bragg, was quite.
Yeah. Yeah, you see, this the whole history of conscientious objection is it's oh, you got a question back here?
Well, I just wanted to add some other.
I see a hand raised.
Well, I just wanted to add some other. Oh, what's going on now? What's going on now?
The audio system seems to be behaving peculiarly.
There's a lag, yeah.
The audio system
Definite
seems to
lag.
be behaving peculiarly. Definite lag.
We can hear you, Terry.
Coming here, another room.
Yeah, I mean, why didn't you just come in here? That would be easier. Oh, what should I do? Should I continue or wait? Oh, very fine.
There we go.
Were you having an issue with something?
No, we were waiting on you to speak.
Oh, you're good.
Oh, it's good.
You muted yourself.
Someone else.
There is a lag, so if you have a question.
Where that's going. Another experiment. Just as another perspective, I was here about the same time. I played benefits for the RAG, and I went to Gentle Thursday, and I was a conscientious objector. In my case, I was living in Dallas at the time that I was called up in the draft. And it was just before I became a member of the Society of Friends. So I didn't feel I could really claim a religious objection. I said I had moral objection to serving in this war in any form. And although there had been some court precedent with Dan Seeger establishing that people could, who had a moral objection, were available. That at this point, I really didn't think they were going to grant me any kind of status at all. And there's a third category that I don't think we've talked about, and that's those who went to prison rather than cooperate with the selective service system. Right. And I thought this draft board was going to put me in that bucket. So I had my bags packed. I was all ready. They granted me 1-0 status, which frankly surprised the hell out of me.
Yeah.
And it ended up, I did alternative service here in Austin at the state hospital. But, there's just for another angle. And I struggled with the idea of, and still do to this day, whether it would have been more appropriate for me to look at the 1AO status.
And I struggle with the prospect of, did I compromise myself and my police by even putting on a uniform?
Well, those were the things that we really went up against.
And I think that is what's unique about Vietnam. When I try to, you say, why is Vietnam so fascinating? Why does it continue to fascinate? Why have 1,000 books been written about Vietnam? And I think one of the distinguishing factors is that everybody had to decide for themselves at that time. And there were many different routes to go. And I'm not self-righteous. I mean, personally, I feel like your decision is just as important as mine. And if you felt patriotic and it was your duty to go there and fight, pick up, well, that's also legitimate, because a lot of people actually felt that sincerely.
Each of us could have been the other one.
Deciding for themselves in a way that no other war in the 20th century did you have such a have this dilemma, this widespread dilemma. And so,
I have another question, Wade.
okay, the hand up.
I don't think that's a hand. I think that's a minute.
Oh, that's the damn cursor.
Okay, so yeah, but I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I just wanted to, and I had a kind of an unusual circumstance. After I finished my undergraduate work, I went immediately to graduate school, so I kept a student deferment. And then I was hired by the University of Texas as assistant professor, and they deferred me again.
I was hired by the University of Texas as assistant professor, and they deferred me again.
And then it was after that, when the war started to really pick up, that I decided that I wanted to make them classify me as 1-0. So I gave up my deferment.
As 1-0.
And they did classify me as 1-0. But by that time, I was really over age. I never served in service.
Over age, so I never served in service.
Yeah.
Now, I do remember back in the day, there were a number of people
Now, I do remember back in the day
who demonstrated against the war in the early days in front of the state capitol.
who demonstrated against
Just a few people were there every Saturday.
the state capitol.
And
We're there every Saturday.
it's difficult to hear yourself say something 10 seconds later.
It's difficult to hear yourself say something 10 seconds later.
But the Friends meeting of Austin was very well formed, and there were a number of people there that were working against the war from an early time.
Well formed, and there were a number of people there that were working against the war from an early time.
And now I'll shut
Yeah, I
up.
mean, some of the demonstrations actually were quite large, like when Hubert Humphrey visited
And now I'll shut up.
There were 10,000 people at the Capitol, and the march from the university on Congress Avenue. That was one that turned violent with tear gas and the police going on a rampage against people. And I was there. I remember it quite well. Yeah, as far as you getting deferment to graduate school, there were certain occupations or majors that were considered in the national interest, and you could actually get a deferment to graduate school. I had also applied for graduate school in the School of History, Department of History, was accepted, and I was drafted out of my first semester of graduate school. I never finished it. So I did my 2S deferment. They didn't accept that for graduate school for me.
So history is not in the national interest.
No. I think some things like chemistry, for instance, they no, history was not in the national interest, and apparently it still isn't. Yes, ma'am.
Went to high school in New Jersey. I graduated high school in 1969. And I remember they would announce who died in Vietnam. And I thought I wanted to join the Army, but my mother said to me, only whores join the Army. And I asked my guidance counselor, she told me it wasn't true, but I listened to my mother anyway. I protested the war in Washington, D.C. I started Brookdale Community College in '69, and a group of us went there as first aid.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually I joined the Navy in a couple years as a corpsman for 5 years.
So you were a corpsman too.
5 years,
Wow.
yes.
Speaking of corpsmen, I think I'm going to relinquish the floor to my former medic colleague here, who was also a combat medic. And I'll let Alan tell you a little bit, because he's been very much involved in the anti-war movement after he came back, and he's done a fantastic photojournalism. Yeah.
Well, yes, back in 1960s, I had been a chaplain, not a chaplain's assistant. I was a Catholic and an altar boy. I've been an altar boy for years and years. Back, the mass was said in Latin and everything. So I was aware of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and he was very fascinated by the special forces. And so that set a tone. I mean, people talk about him being anti-war and had thoughts about getting out of Vietnam, but at least at that time, he was thoroughly engaged in the war. And so I was influenced by that. And of course, there's, social pressures of all kinds on us. But when I got my draft notice and I went to basic training, they asked me what I wanted to do. I said I wanted to be a medic because I'd worked in hospitals as a summer job in high school. And, I didn't want to shoot anybody. And I thought that being a medic would be about the best thing I could do in the Army and learn more medicine. I wanted to be a special forces combat medic. But after about a week in the Army, I realized what I most wanted was out of the Army. So but I went ahead, went to Fort Sam like everybody else, and graduated from medic school. And I went to Fort Carson, Colorado as my first duty station. And I like to read philosophy and theology, so I went to the chapel during the week because no one was ever there. And so I was there reading a book by Teilhard de Chardin called The Making of a Mind, his war letters, because he was a litter bearer during World War I in France. But he was also a paleontologist and a theologian, international renown. And so as I was reading his war letters, the Catholic chaplain walked through and saw me and asked me what I was reading, and we talked about it. He said that he had been he had taught Chardin at the University of Montana. His name was Captain Donald Shea. And I'm happy to say that later on in his career, because he told me he was going to be in the Army for 3 years and get out, but he didn't. He stayed in and became the head of the whole chaplains corps. And there was one person in Vietnam who was the number one hero, and that was Hugh Thompson. He was a helicopter pilot, a warrant officer, helicopter pilot. And in My Lai, he noticed that, some people were huddling and afraid, and he was looking around from his helicopter and landed and realized that these Vietnamese people were going to be killed by us, our troops, if he didn't do anything. So he asked his door gunners if they would back him up, and they said, yes, we will. And he found Lieutenant Calley and said that he was going to take these people onto his helicopter and fly them to safety. And he was going to come back and pick up more of them. And if anybody tried to stop him, his machine gunners would shoot them. You're not going to stop me from doing this. And so he did. He saved over 200 Vietnamese in My Lai from being massacred. And every year after that, he and his one door gunner who survived the war in Vietnam went back for a big celebration thrown in their favor by the Vietnamese people. And he was given an award, Hugh Thompson was, for I think the highest non-combat award the Army could give a person. But other parts of the Army were angry with him for bringing up this whole issue and refused to give him the medal. But someone reported on it, and a congressperson insisted that the Army give him the medal at last, 25 years later. And so they wanted to mail it to him. And so the congressperson said, no, we need a ceremony. And so they're going to have a ceremony at the Vietnam Wall in Washington, D.C. And my chaplain, Donald Shea, pinned the medal on Hugh Thompson. And but even my chaplain was highly conflicted, because a chaplain in the Army, in the end, has to justify the war that people are fighting in. And some of the soldiers were telling him that they wanted to go to Sweden or someplace, Canada, anywhere, get out of the Army. And he was counseling them to stay in the Army, because that was, after all, his job. So there's a whole lot of conflicts going on. But myself, after Donald Shea left, none of the chaplains were as good as he was. And I volunteered to go to Vietnam as a chaplain's assistant. And they readily agreed to that. And I was sent to Vietnam and narrowly missed being plucked out of the chaplain's corps and put back into the medics. But the chaplains fought for me. But the chaplain that I drew was losing his mind, literally losing his mind, because he was an orphan as a child. And he was surrounded by orphans in Vietnam. And he was begging, borrowing, and stealing everything he could to give to the orphanages. That was all he was doing. And it was a good thing to do, but he wasn't being a chaplain to anyone. So I volunteered to be a combat medic with the infantry. And they took me up on that. And like a lot of parts of Vietnam, it was not World War II. I mean, you really were, as Jim was saying, on your own. And I remember they picked me up and flew me in a helicopter to this infantry unit out in the countryside, all by myself, and left me there. So there I was with the infantry unit. And that night, we would send out small teams of soldiers as ambushes. And they ambushed and killed two 14-year-old, more or less, Vietnamese girls. who were walking from one place to another and carrying rifles. They were just being used as rifle transportation. And hand grenades were thrown, and someone on our side was wounded. But I thought to myself, well, I can't ride home to my mother and tell us our glorious army just killed 14-year-old girls. You know, that's not going to make anyone happy. So I had a lot to keep to myself and not mention. But my mother had given me a camera, a little Kodak plastic camera. So I took lots of pictures, and then I would edit all the bad ones out and just send her the pictures of Vietnamese children giving me a flower or the beautiful countryside, because it's a beautiful country. And I kept the rest. But that's what launched my career as a photographer. Because once I started taking pictures in Vietnam, my thought was, people in the United States really don't know what's going on over here. And if you could show them pictures, that's better than talking, because people will argue with you if you talk. It's all about logic and categories and things of that nature. It's not about real life. But if you show them a picture, it's difficult to argue with. They can't say that didn't happen. Well, here's the photograph. Yes, it did happen. So I kept on taking pictures. And but my experiences as a medic, you can imagine, were so bitter that it changed my mind entirely. I said, nothing can justify this. It's all so awful. I think one day the company commander was happy for me to treat Vietnamese people because it's all numbers game, and he would get some benefit if I would treat Vietnamese people. He could write that up, some good thing we did. But one day a woman came to me, and if you can imagine, I mean, here I am, 20 years old with my little medic bag, very limited ability to help people. And the company commander would give me a squad of half a dozen riflemen to protect me. And I could just go out anywhere and set up with my little medic bag, and people would show up. They would just show up out of nowhere, it seemed to me. You know, little children always want a Band-Aid and a vitamin. But this woman showed up, and she must have been 30-something, and her whole side looked like raw meat because she'd been hit by napalm. And it was such an awful thing, and I could do so little. I mean, I could clean her off a bit and use some hydrogen peroxide, and I was able to requisition whatever I wanted. So I requisitioned some medicated gauze, and I just wrapped her with it and then gave her all the rest of it. But of course, I don't speak Vietnamese. I couldn't explain to her, well, you know, after a day or so, you take this off and wash yourself and put on a new batch, and, you know, things of that nature. I couldn't tell her. And if I wanted to give her what she really needed was internal antibiotics, because you want it working from the inside out as well as from the outside in. But I couldn't give her any instructions like, okay, here's a bottle of tetracycline, don't take them all at once, you know, take 1-3 times a day. Well, I couldn't do that. So I was always very frustrated that all I could do was put the tiniest of Band-Aids on open wounds. And so when I got back to the United States from Vietnam, I went to the library because I had been a debater in high school. I said, okay, I'm going to make a case for or against the war in Vietnam, just like a high school debate. And I went through the index of periodical literature, you know, 3x5 cards. In the old days, there were no computers. And I got a pitiful little stack of cards. There wasn't enough information to make a decent decision. Even if you read Foreign Affairs Quarterly and Current Affairs Quarterly and all the usual magazines and newspapers, there wasn't enough good information. So I realized, okay, I need to read history books and I need to read biographies of the major players. And so I did that. And immediately, I mean, the first thing I learned was, oh, this is French colonialism. the United States had paid for the French war budget up to 80%. And I'll throw this in. Martin Luther King's, I think, best and not famous enough speech was Beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence. Because he lays it all out very meticulously, the history of the war in Vietnam. And, but I hadn't heard it. It hadn't gotten to me yet. And that was 67, I think, when he made that speech at the Riverside Baptist Church. And I wish everyone had a copy of it on their nightstand and read it. And then, of course, Muhammad Ali said, I'm a black man. I'm not going to kill a yellow man for the white man. He's pretty direct.
Yeah, he famously said, those Vietnamese, they never called me the N-word.
Yes. Well, you know, the Vietnamese never attacked us. The Gulf of Tonkin thing was made up. I have a friend who was in Vietnam at the time when the Gulf of Tonkin was supposedly attacked, and he was a radio man. So he was listening to the communication between the captain of the destroyer and the people higher up. And they had to explain to him carefully that he had been attacked. Because he said, I don't know what you're talking about. And they said, oh yeah, it was the middle of the night and, you know, this North Vietnamese torpedo boat launched a torpedo at you. He said, oh yes, did that happen? Okay. And so they explained to him what he needed to say to other people, in other words. And that was the Gulf of Tonkin.
Yeah, it was the Tonkin which justified LBJ's expansion of the war.
Yes.
Complete fiction.
LBJ expands the war. So, of course, as usual, it's the Democrats and the Republicans can always get together on one thing, the next war. And so after I read all that, and I was very unhappy. So as soon as I got to the University of Texas, it was in the latter part of 1968, and I enrolled. So I was enrolled at the University of Texas in 69. I joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War immediately as soon as I saw their table, and became active in what the Vietnam Veterans of the War were doing. And as Jim mentioned, well, the RAG, I had a camera, and I was living at the University Y when it was at 2330 Guadalupe in that beautiful old building they foolishly tore down. And became the photographer for the RAG for the next 7 years until it took publication. And went to all the demonstrations, and I was highly involved with the Community United Front, which was the Black Radicals. We started the Breakfast for Children's program, and the Brown Berets. And of course, there was women's liberation and gay liberation, and there's a co-op movement. I mean, everything was happening at the same time. It was an amazing amount of activity. And
Can I interject something here, just along those lines? It's very ironic, but J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, had launched a very illegal program called COINTELPRO, which was spying and playing dirty tricks on people and even probably engaged in assassinations. Austin had its own little counterpart of that, run by Lieutenant Bert Girding of the Austin Police Department. And he had snitches and snoops, and he was playing dirty tricks on, probably played them on you and everybody else. But in the process, he compiled voluminous files and documents on everybody and every demonstration. Luckily, those files have ended up at the Briscoe Center for American History, the Bert Girding files, and that is the most important primary source material about the 60s in Austin that there is. It's the police files of Bert Girding and his secret undercover people. And when I was teaching my course at the university called Dissent in Democracy, the Civil War in Vietnam and Texas, we did research, and I said, any student who finds my name in burglary files will get a bonus. And sure enough, my name came up, my wife's name came up. It's an astounding collection. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yes. Yes, the police knew who I was, so every now and then they would arrest me for taking pictures at some demonstration and destroy my film while I was in the jail cell. So things haven't changed much. But I guess, so being a combat medic launched my photographic career and also opened my mind to, politics in general in a way it never would have happened. And so it made me somewhat humble. I mean, I had to actually go to Vietnam and have my face shoved in it in order to really understand what was going on. So blessed are those who didn't have to touch the wound, as it says in the Bible.
We've got just a couple of minutes. I do have a question.
Okay.
I can address, briefly, is if you were to give some advice to the students today at UT, what would it be?
Well, I would say stay out of the military entirely. There's no good place in the military for you. Any place in the military you're in is supporting the war effort. And I'll tell you maybe one of my worst memories of Vietnam. I had a friend who was a combat medic and was a CO. And he was down on the ground with a soldier who had been shot in the chest, and he was applying patches to him when he saw someone running at them with an AK-47, kill them both, probably. So in the blink of an eye, he picked up the wounded soldier's rifle and shot the Vietnamese person who was running at them to kill them. And he was devastated. I mean, he had done exactly what he didn't want to do, which was kill somebody in combat in this war. But, the rest of us kept telling him, well, and your choice was they're going to kill your patient. And so you acted to save your patient's life. And, but he was emotionally wrecked, and, as you could understand. But my point being, you are in the war. I mean, you're in the middle of it and you're part of it. And also your job as a combat medic or a medical person is to keep up fighting strength. That's your job. You're going to keep up the fighting strength so your fellow soldiers can go out and kill more people. Well, that makes you a very dangerous person as far as the other side is concerned. And if the medic is killed or wounded, that's a huge blow to the morale of your unit. I mean, I felt bad because these guys thought I could do brain surgery with a can opener. They really depended on me. And in some cases, yes, I did save a few lives. Because if someone is shot in the chest, if you can make an airtight seal on their chest, that will save their life. It's easy to do, but you have to know what you're doing.
This is just a personal thing. Before I joined the military, I had a boyfriend I went to the prom with from another school. He was a couple years older than me, and he was a corpsman and went to Cambodia and Vietnam picking up dead bodies. And when he came back home, I went to hug him, and he was like, "Don't come near me." So I was wondering, did it take you a while to get normal when you came back?
Well, it's still taking me a long time to get normal, to make a humorous statement. But yeah, it never goes away. I mean, I'm not as haunted by it as some people. I don't wake up in the middle of the night with sweats, and I don't dream about bad situations. So
That I asked a few years ago about that, not letting me hug them.
But yes, it's true. Because you've suffered so much. And so you've built a wall around yourself, and you don't want to open up that wall and put yourself in a position to be hurt further. And so you're afraid of emotional bonding, really, because it opens up the fact that within you, there's this pain, so much pain that you've suppressed. Yes, so it's very difficult.
Alan, I'd like to respond briefly to your
Yeah.
question too, because I've actually had the privilege of discussing these very things for 10 years with my classes which deal with these subjects. The most distressing thing to me about Vietnam is that the lessons were not learned, and that the same mistakes have been repeated over and over again. So I say to my students, at least we had the draft then, was aware of things. Please stay engaged and remember that democracy is fragile and it is tested every generation again and again, and it is your duty to stand up and defend the Constitution and the principles of this country, and you must be engaged.